When Ghost of Tsushima was released in July 2020, it arrived at a strange moment in gaming history. We were months into a global pandemic, people were stuck at home looking for escape, and here comes this game offering something that felt increasingly rare in the AAA space. A focused single-player experience with a clear artistic vision and no interest in nickel and dimming you with microtransactions or live service nonsense. But more than that, this was Sucker Punch, a Western studio known for the infamous games, attempting something audacious and potentially disastrous. They were making a game about samurai, set in feudal Japan, inspired by the films of Akira Kurosawa, taking on one of the most culturally specific and historically rich settings imaginable. The potential for this to be a cringeworthy mess of Orientalism and cultural appropriation was enormous. Every step of development must have felt like walking through a minefield of ways to get it catastrophically wrong, and yet somehow, against all odds, Sucker Punch created something that not only avoided those pitfalls, but became genuinely special. A game that treats Japanese culture with respect and reverence while still being unmistakably a video game, that balances historical authenticity with gameplay needs, that tells a focused story about honour and sacrifice while letting you just exist in one of the most beautiful open worlds ever created. Ghost of Tsushima is a masterpiece not because it's perfect or flawless, but because it achieves exactly what it sets out to do with remarkable consistency and craft, creating an experience that works on multiple levels simultaneously. The brilliance of Ghost of Tsushima starts with understanding what it's actually trying to be, because it's not really a historical recreation despite being set during the actual Mongol invasion of Tsushima in 1274. It's a love letter to samurai cinema, specifically the films of Kurosawa, but also the broader genre of Chambara and Jidaigeki films that have shaped how we think about samurai and feudal Japan. The game isn't trying to show you what medieval Japan actually was, it's showing you how samurai films depict medieval Japan, with all the romanticism and stylization that comes with that. This is crucial to understanding why the game works, because it gives Sucker Punch permission to prioritize aesthetics and drama over strict historical accuracy, to create moments that feel cinematic rather than realistic, to include game mechanics that serve the fantasy of being a samurai rather than the reality. The game opens with a disclaimer that it's a work of fiction, inspired by historical events, and that's not just covering their legal bases, it's setting expectations about what kind of story you're about to experience. This is mythology, not documentary, and that distinction allows the game to be what it needs to be. The story follows Jin Sakai, one of the last surviving samurai after the Mongol invasion devastates Tsushima. The game opens with a battle on Komoda Beach where Jin and his uncle Lord Shimura lead the samurai of Tsushima against the invading Mongol forces led by Khotun Khan. It's a disaster. The samurai are outnumbered and outmatched, their traditional tactics and honour-bound fighting style completely ineffective against the Mongols' brutal pragmatism and superior numbers. Jin watches his fellow samurai cut down, sees his uncle captured, and nearly dies himself. He's saved by Yuna, a thief who nurses him back to health, and this is where Jin's journey really begins. He has to reclaim Tsushima from the Mongols, rescue his uncle, and save his people. But the traditional samurai methods failed catastrophically at Komoda Beach, so Jin has to find a new way to fight, adopting stealth tactics and guerrilla warfare that go against everything he was taught about honour and the samurai code. The central conflict of the game is Jin's internal struggle between being the samurai his uncle raised him to be and becoming the Ghost, a legend who uses fear and deception as weapons, who kills from the shadows rather than facing enemies openly. It's a story about the cost of pragmatism, about what you sacrifice when you compromise your principles for practical necessity, about whether the ends justify the means when your people's survival is at stake. Jin Sakai is a perfect protagonist for this story because he's conflicted and changing throughout rather than being a static badass. At the start of the game, he's a true believer in the samurai code, convinced that honour and tradition are worth dying for, that there's a right way to fight and live even if that way leads to defeat. Daisuke Tsuji's performance brings such earnestness to Jin. You believe completely that this man was raised in this culture and internalised these values. Jin isn't pretending to care about honour. He genuinely believes in it at a deep level because it's all he's ever known. His uncle Shimura raised him after his father died, taught him what it means to be samurai, and Jin has spent his entire life trying to live up to those expectations, trying to be worthy of his family name and his place in society. So when Yuna suggests using poison against the Mongols, something that goes against every principle Jin holds, his horror and resistance feel genuine. He's not being stubborn or stupid. He's being asked to violate something fundamental to his identity, to become something he was taught to despise. The game could have easily made Jin immediately willing to do whatever it takes, turning him into a generic action hero who adapts instantly to new circumstances. But that would undercut the entire point of the story, which is about the psychological and spiritual cost of abandoning your principles even when you have to do it to survive. The way Jin gradually becomes the Ghost is one of the best character arcs in recent gaming, because it's not about him suddenly deciding to change, it's about necessity slowly eroding his resistance. Every time Jin uses stealth or deception, he justifies it to himself as a temporary measure, something he has to do right now, but won't need to do once he gets stronger or gathers more allies. He keeps telling himself he's still a samurai, that he's just adapting his tactics while maintaining his honour. But each compromise makes the next one easier. Each tactical victory using dishonourable methods makes it harder to go back to the old ways. There's a mission early on where you poison Mongol supplies, and Jin is clearly uncomfortable with it, arguing with Yuna about whether this is acceptable. But by the middle of the game, when you're assassinating Mongol leaders and spreading terror through enemy camps, Jin has stopped arguing and started rationalizing. He's still telling himself stories about honor, but his actions tell a different story. The genius is that the player experiences this same journey through the gameplay. At first, you probably try to fight honorably, facing enemies head-on in duels and standoffs. But the game keeps showing you how much more effective stealth is, how you can clear entire camps without taking damage if you just use the tools the game gives you. And slowly you start using those tools more, rationalizing it the same way Jin does, and before you know it you're playing as an assassin in all but name. The relationship between Jin and his uncle Shimura is the emotional core of the story, and the lens through which the game explores its themes about honor, tradition, and the cost of change. Shimura is everything a samurai should be according to the code, brave and honourable and unwavering in his principles, willing to die rather than compromise. He's also Jin's father figure, the man who raised him and shaped him, whose approval Jin desperately wants. When Shimura is captured by the Mongols early in the game, rescuing him becomes Jin's primary motivation. But as Jin becomes the Ghost, as he uses tactics that Shimura would consider dishonourable, the tension between them grows. Shimura hears the rumours about the Ghost and doesn't realise it's Jin at first, condemning these tactics as cowardly and disgraceful. When he finds out the truth, that his nephew is the one using these methods, he's genuinely hurt and angry. From Shimura's perspective, Jin has betrayed everything he was taught, has dishonoured their family and the samurai class itself. He can't see that Jin's methods are actually working, that the ghost is inspiring the people of Tsushima and striking fear into the Mongols in ways that traditional samurai warfare never could. The game doesn't make Shimura a villain, or even really wrong. His perspective is completely consistent with his values and his understanding of the world. In his framework, honour is more important than survival. Doing things the right way matters more than winning. That's a hard position for modern audiences to sympathise with because we're pragmatists. By nature we think survival and victory are what matter. But the game asks you to understand where Shimura is coming from, to see that his adherence to honour isn't stupidity, it's the foundation of his entire identity and worldview. If honour doesn't matter, if you can just abandon principles when they become inconvenient, then what's the point of having principles at all? What separates you from the barbarians you're fighting? These are real questions the game takes seriously rather than dismissing. And the tragedy is that both Jin and Shimura are right from their own perspectives, and their love for each other makes the conflict even more painful, because neither wants to hurt the other, but neither can back down from what they believe. The game builds this tension throughout the 3 acts, with Shimura and Jin working together, but increasingly at odds about methods and principles. Act 1 is mostly about Jin building his legend and gathering allies, with the conflict still mostly internal. Act 2 raises the stakes as Jin's reputation as the ghost spreads, and Shimura starts hearing troubling reports about these dishonourable tactics. Act 3 brings everything to a head, as the final push to retake Tsushima requires choosing between Jin's effectiveness and Shimura's principles. The shogun, hearing about the ghost and these shameful tactics, issues a decree that Jin must be executed for dishonouring the samurai. Shimura is ordered to kill his own nephew, to choose between his loyalty to his lord and his love for Jin. The game makes you feel the weight of this impossible choice, this tragedy that was inevitable from the moment Jin picked up the first smoke bomb and decided that survival mattered more than honour. The ending of Ghost of Tsushima is what elevates it from a very good game to a genuine masterpiece, because it has the courage to commit to tragedy rather than offering an easy out. After defeating Khotun Khan and saving Tsushima, after accomplishing everything he set out to do, Jin is declared a traitor by the shogun. Shimura is given the order to execute him, and the game forces you to duel your uncle, the man who raised you, in a fight where both of you are trying to avoid killing the other, but knowing that one of you has to fall. It's heartbreaking in the way the best tragedies are, where you can see exactly how you got here and understand that every step made sense, but the destination is unbearable. The duel itself is beautifully designed, intimate and personal, stripped of all the game's usual mechanics, just 2 swordsmen who love each other forced to fight to the death. The game gives you a choice at the end: kill Shimura and give him an honourable death, or spare him and let him live in disgrace. Neither choice is satisfying because both involve loss and pain. If you kill Shimura, you honour his request and the traditions that defined his life, but you also complete your transformation into someone who would have horrified the Jin. From the beginning of the game, if you spare him, you show mercy and reject the cycle of honour-bound violence, but you condemn Shimura to live with the shame of failure, to be known as the samurai who couldn't even complete his final duty. The game doesn't tell you which choice is correct because there isn't a correct choice. It's a tragedy, and tragedies don't have happy endings, they have inevitable endings. Jin saved Tsushima, he protected his people, he defeated the invasion, and his reward is exile. hunted by the very nation he saved, forever separated from his family and his home, carrying the weight of everything he sacrificed to achieve victory. That's powerful storytelling. The willingness to show that doing the right thing can cost you everything, that there's no guarantee of reward or recognition for your sacrifices. Most games would have found a way to let Jin have his cake and eat it too, to let him be both the honourable samurai and the effective warrior, to reconcile with his uncle and be celebrated as a hero. Ghost of Tsushima understands that you can't have it both ways, that choosing pragmatism over principle has consequences, that you can't break every rule and tradition and expect to remain part of the society that created those rules. Jin becomes the ghost and saves Tsushima, but he loses himself in the process, or at least loses the version of himself that Shimura raised him to be. Whether that's worth it is a question the game leaves for you to answer. The supporting cast enriches this central story with their own perspectives on the themes. Yuna is Jin's opposite in many ways, someone who never had the luxury of honour, who grew up as a thief because that was the only way to survive. She's the one who pushes Jin to be practical, to do what works rather than what's honourable, and she doesn't understand his internal conflict because honour was never an option for her. Yuna's story is about survival and family, about doing whatever it takes to protect her brother Taka, and she has no patience for Jin's hand-wringing about proper samurai behaviour when people are dying. Her perspective is valuable because it shows that honour is a luxury that the lower classes can't afford, that the samurai code exists to serve the samurai class and doesn't account for people like her who were never included in that social structure. But Yuna also shows the cost of pure pragmatism, the way constantly doing whatever's necessary hardens you and makes it difficult to trust or connect with others. She's survived, but she's also alone and carrying trauma that she can't process because she never had time to stop and feel things. Masako is another key character, a warrior whose entire family was murdered, and she's consumed by revenge. Her storyline is about the futility of vengeance, how killing the people responsible for your pain doesn't actually heal anything, how revenge just creates more emptiness. Jin helps her hunt down the conspirators who killed her family, and with each one she becomes more hollow, realizing that this isn't bringing her family back or making her feel better. By the end of her arc, she's killed everyone responsible, and feels nothing except the weight of all that death. It's a dark parallel to Jin's story, showing what happens when you completely abandon restraint in pursuit of your goals. Masako chose revenge over everything else, and it destroyed her even as she achieved her objective. The game is asking whether Jin is doing the same thing, whether his pragmatic approach to saving Tsushima is costing him something essential that he won't be able to get back. Ishikawa is an archery master dealing with his own failure, having trained a student named Tomo who surpassed him and then turned against him, now working for the Mongols. His story is about pride and the teacher-student relationship, about what you do when someone you trained uses everything you taught them for the wrong purposes. Ishikawa can't accept that he failed Tomo, that maybe his teaching methods or his priorities were wrong, so he focuses on hunting her down and killing her to erase his mistake. It's cowardice masquerading as duty, and Jin eventually calls him out on it. Ishikawa's arc is about the older generation's refusal to adapt or admit fault, the way tradition can become an excuse for not examining your own failures. It parallels Shimura's inability to accept that the old ways failed at Komoda Beach, that maybe the samurai approach to warfare was outdated and needed to evolve. Norio is a warrior monk struggling with his faith, questioning whether the Buddha would approve of killing even to protect the innocent. His storyline engages with Buddhist philosophy, and the contradiction between religious pacifism and the reality of needing to fight against evil. Norio wants to believe there's a peaceful solution, that spiritual strength can overcome physical violence, but the Mongol invasion forces him to confront that sometimes violence is necessary, that pacifism in the face of aggression just allows evil to flourish. His crisis of faith mirrors Jin's crisis of honor, both men struggling with the gap between their ideals and the harsh necessities of their situation. Norio eventually makes peace with being a warrior monk, finding a way to maintain his faith while accepting that sometimes protecting the innocent requires taking up arms. It's a more optimistic resolution than Jin gets, suggesting that it's possible to adapt your beliefs without completely abandoning them. But Norio also doesn't have the same institutional pressure that Jin faces from the shogunate. Kenji provides comic relief, but he's also thematically relevant. A sake merchant who's completely out of his depth, constantly getting into trouble and needing Jin to bail him out. His stories are lighter in tone, often ending with things going hilariously wrong, but they show the perspective of ordinary people trying to survive the invasion. Kenji isn't a warrior or a noble, he's just a businessman who wants to make money and not die, and his pragmatic focus on profit and survival, regardless of honor or tradition, is another perspective on the game's central questions. He's completely shameless about using dishonorable tactics, because he was never bound by the samurai code in the first place, and his success, despite his lack of principles, challenges Jin's assumption that honor is necessary for a good life. The gameplay of Ghost of Tsushima is where the game's themes and aesthetics come together in perfect harmony, creating an experience that feels distinctly different from other open-world games, despite using familiar mechanics. The combat system is the heart of the game, and it's designed to make you feel like a master swordsman from the moment you first draw your katana. This isn't a game where you start weak and slowly build up power through RPG systems. You're already deadly from the beginning, able to cut down multiple enemies if you have the skill to read their attacks and time your counters. The combat is built on observation and timing rather than button mashing, with different enemy types requiring different approaches, forcing you to stay alert and adapt to each encounter. The standoff mechanic is perfect for this, letting you challenge enemies to a duel before a fight starts, creating these tense moments where you're watching for the enemy's movement, waiting for that split second when you need to strike. It's pure Kurosawa, the standoff scene from every samurai movie, and it feels incredible when you perfectly time a standoff and cut down 3 enemies before the fight even begins. The stance system is genius because it makes you think tactically about each encounter without bogging you down in RPG complexity. You have 4 different stances, each one effective against a different enemy type, and you have to switch between them mid-combat to deal with groups effectively. Stone stance breaks shield defences, water stance counters swordsmen, wind stance is for spearmen, and moon stance handles brutes. This creates a rhythm to combat where you're constantly assessing the enemy composition and switching stances appropriately. And when you're in flow state, when you're switching stances smoothly and countering attacks perfectly, you feel like an unstoppable swordmaster. The game is generous with its timing windows, more forgiving than something like Sekiro or Dark Souls, because the fantasy isn't about overcoming brutal difficulty. It's about feeling like a badass samurai from a movie. You're supposed to win these fights, supposed to cut through enemies with grace and precision, and the combat system is tuned to make that happen, while still requiring enough skill that you feel accomplished. But then there's the ghost weapons and tactics, the tools that make Jin so effective, but also so dishonorable. smoke bombs that let you vanish and assassinate enemies kunai that let you throw knives from range, sticky bombs that create explosions, hallucination darts that make enemies attack each other. These tools are incredibly effective, letting you clear enemy camps with stealth and strategy rather than direct combat, and the game constantly tempts you to use them. You could fight your way through an enemy camp honourably, using your sword and facing every enemy directly, but it's harder and riskier. Or you could use stealth, pick them off one by one, use your tools to create confusion and fear, and clear the camp without taking a hit. The gameplay is showing you the same choice Jin faces in the story, and most players end up doing what Jin does, telling themselves they'll fight honourably, but gradually relying more and more on the dishonourable tactics because they work so well. It's ludonarrative harmony, the rare case where the gameplay and story are reinforcing the same themes rather than contradicting each other. The duels are the highlight of the combat system, one-on-one fights against significant opponents that strip away all your tools and abilities, leaving you with just your sword and your skill. These are the most cinematic moments in the game, carefully choreographed encounters that feel like the climactic sword fights from samurai films. The camera work during duels is different from regular combat, more focused and dramatic, creating these beautiful compositions as you and your opponent circle each other. The duels are challenging but fair, requiring you to learn each opponent's patterns and time your counters precisely, and defeating a difficult duel opponent is one of the most satisfying feelings in the game. These moments are when Jin is most purely a samurai, when he's fighting the way Shimura taught him, facing an opponent directly with nothing but his blade and his skill. It's notable that the game reserves duels for the most important story fights, suggesting that this honourable form of combat is special, that it means something more than just another battle. The open world design is where Ghost of Tsushima really sets itself apart from other games in the genre, because Sucker Punch made the brilliant decision to minimise UI and let the world itself guide you. Instead of waypoints and minimap markers cluttering your screen, you follow the wind. You set a destination, and the wind blows in that direction, guiding you naturally without taking you out of the experience. It sounds like a small thing, but it completely changes how you interact with the world. You're looking at the environment instead of staring at a minimap. You're paying attention to the landscape and the natural features. You're existing in the world rather than just navigating through it. Birds and foxes lead you to points of interest. Golden trees mark important locations. Smoke on the horizon indicates enemy activity. The game is teaching you to read the world like Jin would, using natural signs and observation rather than magical GPS and quest markers. This design philosophy creates a sense of immersion that most open-world games can't match, making exploration feel organic and discovery feel earned. The world of Tsushima itself is staggeringly beautiful, possibly the most gorgeous open world ever created. Sucker Punch understood that if they were making a love letter to samurai cinema, the visuals had to match that cinematic quality, and they succeeded beyond what seemed possible. Every area of the map is distinctive and memorable, from the golden fields of pampas grass swaying in the wind to the red maple forests of autumn, to the snow-covered mountains in the north. The lighting is extraordinary, with volumetric fog rolling through forests, sunbeams breaking through storm clouds, dynamic weather creating atmosphere and mood. The game has a photo mode that's so robust and powerful that players have created countless stunning images, treating the game like a virtual photography platform. The fact that Ghost of Tsushima has a thriving community of virtual photographers years after release speaks to the visual achievement Sucker Punch pulled off. But the masterstroke, the thing that cements this game as something special, is Kurosawa mode. You can play the entire game in black and white with a film grain filter and modified audio, making it look and sound like an actual Kurosawa film. This isn't just a visual filter slapped on. They recorded different dialogue for this mode, adjusted the sound design, even changed how the wind looks. Playing in Kurosawa mode is a completely different experience, losing the game's vibrant colours but gaining this incredible authenticity to the source material. Blood shows up darker against the black and white, making combat more visceral. The cinematography is even more striking when you're not distracted by colour. The whole game takes on this dreamlike mythic quality. The fact that Sucker Punch put this much effort into what's essentially an optional display mode shows their commitment to honouring the films that inspired them. Most studios would have just shipped a black and white filter and called it a day, but Sucker Punch went all the way, making Kurosawa mode a legitimate way to experience the entire game. The side content in Ghost of Tsushima is where the game shows both its strengths and its weaknesses. The mythic tales are excellent. Quest lines inspired by Japanese mythology and folklore that lead to powerful equipment and techniques. Each one tells a complete story, often with moral ambiguity or tragic endings, and they feel substantial rather than like filler. The Tales of Tsushima, which are essentially character side quests for your major allies, are well written and meaningful, developing these characters and exploring the themes. But then there are the more generic open world activities, and this is where the game stumbles a bit. Clearing Mongol camps, finding hot springs, writing haiku, following foxes to shrines, liberating farmsteads. These activities are fine, but they're also repetitive and start to feel like padding after a while. The game needed these activities to fill out the open world and give players things to do, but they're not particularly innovative or interesting beyond the first few times you do them. The haiku writing is charming initially, finding beautiful vistas and composing poetry about nature and solitude, but it's the same activity every time with no variation. The fox shrines are cute, following a fox through the woods to a shrine where you pet the fox and get a charm upgrade. But after you've done it 30 times, it's just busy work. The Mongol camps at least involve combat, so they stay somewhat engaging, but they blur together, each one just another collection of enemies to defeat with slightly different layouts. This is the curse of the open world genre, needing to fill a large map with activities but struggling to make those activities meaningful after the first handful. Ghost of Tsushima is better than most games in this regard. The main story and character quests are strong enough to carry the experience, but it still has that Ubisoft-style content bloat where you're checking things off a list rather than organically discovering interesting content. The game tries to encourage exploration and wandering by making the world beautiful and placing interesting encounters throughout, but it also can't resist putting icons on your map and giving you checklists of collectibles to find. This creates a tension between the game's stated desire for you to explore naturally and its actual design that points you toward every piece of content. Players who engage with the completionist aspects of the game end up spending dozens of hours doing repetitive activities to clear every question mark off the map, which isn't necessarily bad if you enjoy that kind of gameplay, but it does work against the more artistic intentions of the game. The perfect Ghost of Tsushima playthrough is probably the one where you ignore a lot of the collectibles and side activities, focusing on the main story and the character tales, letting the world be something you pass through rather than something you need to 100% complete. But the game doesn't really support that approach, constantly showing you incomplete objectives and uncollected items creating that anxiety that you're missing something if you don't clear every activity. The character progression systems are serviceable but nothing special. Standard skill trees where you unlock new abilities and increase your stats. You get technique points from major encounters and activities, spend them on new moves and upgrades, gradually becoming more powerful and versatile. It's fine, it works, it gives you a sense of progression and rewards you for exploration and combat. But it's also the most conventional part of the game's design, the place where it feels most like every other open-world action game. The game would probably work just as well without the RPG progression systems, just letting you unlock new abilities through story progression, rather than spending points. But I understand why they included it. Players expect character progression in open-world games. It's a standard feature of the genre. At least the upgrades feel meaningful and change how you play rather than just being stat increases. The story pacing is generally excellent, with the 3-act structure giving the narrative clear momentum and escalation. Act 1 is about Jin establishing himself as the ghost and gathering allies, learning what happened to Tsushima during the invasion, and building the foundation for his resistance. Act 2 raises the stakes, pushing further into Mongol-controlled territory and deepening Jin's conflict with Shimura as the moral costs of his tactics become clearer. Act 3 brings everything to a climax with the assault on the Mongol stronghold and the final confrontation with Khotun Khan, followed by the tragic resolution with Shimura. The game does have some pacing issues in the middle, where the open-world activities can stall your momentum if you let them, and there are missions that feel like they're padding out the runtime rather than advancing the story meaningfully. But overall, the narrative maintains its focus and builds to a satisfying if heartbreaking conclusion. The villains in Ghost of Tsushima are somewhat underdeveloped, which is one of the game's few significant weaknesses. Khotun Khan is intimidating and effective as an antagonist, but we don't spend enough time with him or learn enough about his motivations and character. He's defined mostly by his pragmatism and his willingness to use psychological warfare, burning villages and taking hostages to break the spirit of Tsushima's defenders. He's a dark mirror to Jin in some ways, someone else who's willing to use dishonourable tactics to achieve his military objectives, but the game doesn't develop this parallel as much as it could. Most of the game you're fighting generic Mongol forces rather than memorable individual enemies, and while the duels provide some character moments with enemy warriors, they're brief encounters rather than developed rivals. The game needed a stronger antagonist presence throughout, more scenes with Khotun Khan showing his intelligence and his perspective, maybe a rival character among the Mongols who serves as Jin's opposite number. As it stands, the Mongols are more a faceless threat than characters, which makes the invasion feel impersonal, even though it's supposed to be this existential crisis for Tsushima. The historical accuracy question is interesting, because the game is both deeply researched and completely fictional. Sucker Punch clearly did extensive research into feudal Japan. The clothing and architecture and weapons are all period appropriate. The cultural practices and social hierarchies are depicted with reasonable accuracy. But the invasion itself is heavily fictionalized, the timeline compressed, the key events changed, and the entire character roster invented. There was a real Mongol invasion of Tsushima in 1274, but the historical details are sparse and the game takes massive liberties with what happened. This is absolutely fine. The game is clear that it's fiction, but it's worth noting that this is not a historically accurate recreation. If you want to learn about the actual Mongol invasions of Japan, this game is a starting point at best. A collection of authentic details in service of a completely invented story. The game's greatest historical accuracy is in its emotional and thematic authenticity to samurai cinema rather than historical fact, and that's what matters for what it's trying to do. The representation of Japanese culture and the question of cultural appropriation is something that deserves serious discussion. Sucker Punch is an American studio making a game about Japanese history and culture, borrowing heavily from Japanese artistic traditions, and there was legitimate concern about whether they would handle this respectfully or turn it into an Orientalist fantasy. To their credit, Sucker Punch approached this with humility and care, consulting with Japanese historians and cultural experts, hiring Japanese actors for Japanese characters, researching extensively, and trying to honour the source material rather than just mining it for exotic aesthetics. The response from Japan was largely positive, with many Japanese players and critics praising the game's beauty and its reverence for their cultural traditions. The game sold extremely well in Japan, which suggests that Japanese audiences felt it was respectful and authentic enough to embrace. That said, this is still a Western interpretation of Japanese culture, filtered through Japanese films that were themselves romanticized versions of history. There are definitely moments where the game relies on stereotypes or simplified versions of complex cultural concepts. The rigid adherence to honor and the samurai code is more cinematic than historical. Real samurai were often quite pragmatic and flexible in their tactics. The portrayal of Mongols is pretty one-dimensional, depicting them mostly as savage invaders without much cultural nuance or individual characterization. The game treats Buddhism and Shinto somewhat superficially, including them as aesthetic and cultural elements without deeply engaging with their philosophical complexity. These aren't damning criticisms. The game never claimed to be a comprehensive or scholarly treatment of Japanese culture, but they're worth acknowledging as limitations of the approach. The question of whether Western studios should make games about other cultures is complicated and doesn't have a simple answer. On one hand, cross-cultural exchange and appreciation is valuable, and limiting who can tell what stories based on their cultural background can be restrictive and counterproductive. On the other hand, there's a long history of Western media appropriating and misrepresenting other cultures, and we should be mindful of power dynamics and respectful in our engagement with cultures that aren't our own. Ghost of Tsushima threads this needle about as well as could be hoped, showing genuine respect and care while still being a video game that takes liberties for the sake of gameplay and drama. The fact that it was embraced by Japanese audiences suggests they succeeded, but that doesn't mean it's above criticism or that every choice they made was perfect. It's a conversation worth having, and the game exists as an example of Western developers engaging seriously with non-Western culture in ways that are mostly respectful and informed. The music by Ilan Eshkeri and Shigeru Umebayashi is crucial to the game's atmosphere and emotional impact, blending Western orchestral scoring with traditional Japanese instruments to create something that honours both the game's cinematic inspirations and its cultural setting. The score uses shakuhachi flutes and taiko drums and shamisen, alongside strings and percussion, creating music that feels appropriately Japanese without being stereotypical or reductive. The battle themes are intense and driving. The exploration music is contemplative and beautiful. The emotional moments are scored with heartbreaking restraint. The music knows when to be present and when to step back, often letting the ambient sound of wind and nature carry scenes, trusting that sometimes silence is more powerful than the most beautiful melody. The adaptive music system changes based on what you're doing, smoothly transitioning between exploration and combat states, building tension during stealth infiltrations and exploding into action when you're discovered. It's technically impressive, but more importantly it serves the experience, making the world feel responsive and alive rather than just having a static soundtrack. The main theme, with its haunting flute melody and driving percussion, is instantly recognizable and captures the game's tone perfectly. Melancholic but heroic, traditional but accessible. The music for the major duels is particularly excellent, stripping away the orchestral elements to focus on traditional instruments, creating this intimate tension that makes these encounters feel like the important moments they are. The cultural impact of Ghost of Tsushima extends beyond just the game itself. The island of Tsushima saw a tourism boom after the game's release, with people wanting to visit the real locations that inspired the game. The mayor of the actual Tsushima even gave Sucker Punch an award for promoting awareness of the island's history and culture. The game sparked interest in Japanese history and culture among Western audiences, led people to seek out Kurosawa films and learn about the Mongol invasions, created this whole moment of cultural exchange facilitated by a video game. That's not nothing, that's a genuinely positive outcome of the game's success. The fact that it made people curious about and appreciative of another culture, rather than just treating it as exotic window dressing, suggests Sucker Punch succeeded in their goal of creating something respectful and meaningful. The game also influenced the industry in meaningful ways, showing that single-player narrative-focused games could still be massive commercial successes in an era when everyone was chasing live service models and battle royale trends. Ghost of Tsushima sold over 10 million copies, received widespread critical acclaim, and won numerous awards including Game of the Year from several outlets. It proved there was still a huge audience for well-crafted single-player experiences that respected your time and didn't try to nickel and dime you with monetization. The success of Ghost of Tsushima alongside games like God of War and Spider-Man reinforced that PlayStation's investment in high-quality exclusive single-player games was commercially viable and artistically valuable. It's part of why we still get these kinds of games in an industry that's constantly trying to convince itself that only multiplayer and live service can succeed. The Legends multiplayer mode that was added post-launch deserves mention, because it's a perfect example of DLC done right. Instead of charging for it, Sony and Sucker Punch released it as a free update, adding a cooperative multiplayer mode inspired by Japanese mythology and folklore. It's completely separate from the main story, set in a more fantastical version of the world where you and up to 3 other players take on waves of supernatural enemies. The mode includes story missions, survival challenges and raids, all with unique rewards and progression systems. It's substantial content that could have easily been sold as an expansion, but they gave it away free to everyone who owned the game. The mode is also genuinely fun, taking the combat system and adapting it for cooperative play, adding character classes with different abilities and playstyles. It's not just a lazy horde mode, it's a thoughtfully designed experience that respects the main game's aesthetic while being its own thing. The Legends mode showed that Sucker Punch understood they'd created something special with Ghost of Tsushima and wanted to support it properly rather than just moving on to the next project. The director's cut that was released for PS5 added another island, Iki, with a substantial story expansion that explores Jin's past and his relationship with his father. The Iki Island expansion is excellent, giving you more of what made the main game work while telling a more personal story about Jin confronting trauma and guilt. The main game was about Jin's conflict with Shimura and the Samurai Code, but Iki is about Jin dealing with his father's legacy and his own failures. It's darker and more psychological, with elements of mysticism and hallucination as Jin is poisoned and has to fight through his own demons, both literal and metaphorical. The expansion adds new enemy types, new abilities, and new areas to explore, and while it's not essential to understanding Jin's story, it enriches his character and gives you more time with him after the main game's tragic conclusion. The fact that the expansion is this high quality, maintaining the tone and craft of the base game rather than feeling like an afterthought, speaks to Sucker Punch's commitment to the game and the world they created. The technical performance, especially in the director's cut on PS5, is exceptional. The game runs at 60 FPS in performance mode while maintaining stunning visual quality, or you can choose resolution mode for native 4K at 30 FPS with even more detail. The loading times are nearly instantaneous thanks to the PS5's SSD, fast travel happens in seconds, and there are no loading screens when moving between areas. The haptic feedback on the DualSense controller adds another layer of immersion, letting you feel the tension in the bowstring when you draw Jin's bow, the clash of swords during combat, the rumble of thunder during storms. The adaptive triggers make actions like drawing a bow physically demanding, creating this connection between what Jin is doing and what you're doing with your hands. These technical features might seem like gimmicks, but in practice they enhance the experience significantly, making you feel more present in the world and more connected to Jin's actions. The accessibility options in Ghost of Tsushima are comprehensive and thoughtful, allowing players with various disabilities to experience the game. There are options for visual impairments, including high contrast modes and screen reader support, options for hearing impairments with detailed subtitles and visual cues for audio information, and options for motor impairments, including remappable controls and difficulty adjustments. The game lets you customize nearly every aspect of the experience to suit your needs without judging you, or limiting what content you can access. This isn't just good from an ethical standpoint, it's good design that makes the game available to more people, and shows that accessibility and artistic vision aren't in conflict. You can make your game beautiful and challenging and meaningful, while still ensuring that people with disabilities can play it. The influence of Kurosawa and other Japanese filmmakers on Ghost of Tsushima goes deeper than just the visual aesthetic or Kurosawa mode. The game's structure and storytelling techniques are borrowed from these films, the way it uses silence and stillness between moments of action, the way it frames scenes and uses negative space, the way it treats violence as both brutal and beautiful. Kurosawa's films often dealt with similar themes about honor and duty, and the costs of violence, about men caught between tradition and necessity, about the end of eras, and the painful transition to modernity. Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, Sanjuro, Throne of Blood. These films all explore what happens when the old ways fail and people have to adapt or die. Ghost of Tsushima is in conversation with these films, not just copying their aesthetic, but engaging with their themes and ideas, creating something that feels like it belongs to the same tradition, while still being unmistakably a video game. The game also draws from other sources, the manga and anime traditions of samurai stories, the historical accounts of the Mongol invasions, the landscape and culture of Tsushima itself. Sucker Punch synthesized all these influences into something coherent and distinctive, a game that feels deeply rooted in Japanese culture while still being accessible to Western audiences who might not be familiar with all the references and traditions. It's a balancing act that could have easily tipped into cultural tourism or superficial appropriation, but the game's earnestness and attention to detail keep it grounded. You can tell that the people making this game genuinely love and respect the source material, that this wasn't just a cynical attempt to cash in on samurai aesthetics, but a sincere effort to honour a culture and artistic tradition. The photography community that's emerged around Ghost of Tsushima is fascinating and speaks to how successful the game's visual design is. The photo mode is incredibly robust, giving you control over every aspect of composition, lighting, depth of field, colour grading, and more. Players have created stunning images that look like professional photography or paintings, treating the game as a canvas for artistic expression. There are entire social media accounts dedicated to Ghost of Tsushima photography, competitions and showcases, people teaching composition and lighting techniques using the game as their medium. This emergent creative community is something Sucker Punch probably didn't fully anticipate, but it's a testament to what they created. The game is beautiful enough, and the tools are powerful enough that people want to spend time just creating art within it, finding new ways to capture the world and express themselves through virtual photography. The game's representation of combat and violence is worth examining, because it walks a fine line between being a power fantasy and being thoughtful about the costs of violence. The combat is undeniably satisfying. Cutting down enemies with precise sword strikes feels good in the visceral way that video game violence is designed to feel good. But the game also constantly reminds you that Jin is killing people, that each enemy is someone's son or brother or father, that the Mongol soldiers are following orders just like Jin follows orders. The game doesn't moralize excessively about this. It's still a game where combat is a primary activity, and you're going to kill hundreds of people over the course of the story, but it doesn't completely dehumanize enemies either, particularly in the duels where you're facing named opponents with their own stories and motivations. The game is asking you to hold two thoughts simultaneously, that this combat is exciting and fun, and also that Jin is becoming a killer who will be haunted by this violence for the rest of his life. The environmental storytelling throughout Tsushima is subtle but effective, showing the impact of the Mongol invasion through burned villages and abandoned homes and mass graves. You see the destruction they've caused, the lives they've ruined, and it makes the stakes feel real beyond just the abstract concept of an invasion. The game uses these environmental details to create atmosphere and reinforce the narrative without needing explicit exposition. You can read the situation from what you observe, understand what happened here, and why Jin's mission matters. The attention to detail in these environmental narratives, the way each location tells a story through its layout and condition, is part of what makes the world feel lived in and real despite being a video game world. The weather and time of day systems aren't just visual flourishes, they affect gameplay and create different experiences in the same locations. Fighting in a rainstorm with reduced visibility is different from fighting on a clear day. Sneaking through an enemy camp at night is easier than during daylight, but also more dangerous if you're discovered. The game uses these systems to create variety and atmosphere, making the world feel dynamic and unpredictable. The way storms roll in with dramatic cloud formations and wind, the way fog settles in valleys at dawn, the way sunset light filters through trees. These aren't just pretty effects, they're creating mood and feeling that enhances the emotional impact of what's happening in the story. The horse riding and the relationship between Jin and his horse is another detail that enhances the experience. Your horse isn't just a vehicle, it's a companion that you care for and bond with. You can customize your horse's appearance, pet it and feed it to restore its stamina, whistle to call it from anywhere. The horse follows paths automatically if you're not actively steering, letting you enjoy the scenery or engage with other systems while travelling. The animation of horse riding is beautiful and realistic, and the horse reacts to terrain and obstacles naturally. When your horse dies, you feel genuine loss, and the game acknowledges this by having Jin mourn and then acquire a new horse, carrying forward the relationship with each new mount. It's a small system, but it creates emotional attachment and makes travelling the world more personal than just fast travelling between waypoints. The mythic quality of the ghost legend and how it spreads across the island is one of the game's most interesting narrative elements. You see the effect of your actions rippling through Tsushima as people start telling stories about the ghost, exaggerating your exploits and turning you into a supernatural figure. Peasants worship you as a protector spirit, Mongols fear you as a demon, and Jin himself is troubled by becoming this legend that's separate from who he actually is. The game is exploring how myths are created, how a man becomes a symbol, and what that transformation costs the person at the centre of it. Jin wanted to save Tsushima, but in doing so he's created something beyond his control, a legend that will outlive him and define how he's remembered regardless of who he actually was. There's tragedy in that disconnect between Jin the person and the ghost the myth, in the way Jin's humanity gets lost in the legend. The game's treatment of the lower classes and how they're affected by samurai conflicts is more nuanced than most period pieces. Yuna represents the people who have always been on the margins, who've never had the luxury of honour because they were too busy surviving. The game shows you how samurai warfare destroys the lives of peasants and workers, how these grand conflicts between warriors and invaders are paid for in the blood and suffering of ordinary people. Jin's journey involves recognizing this, understanding that the samurai code he was taught serves the samurai class but doesn't account for everyone else. His transformation into the ghost is partly about rejecting that class-based morality and fighting for all of Tsushima's people, not just the noble families. It's a more democratic and egalitarian approach to heroism than traditional samurai stories usually allow. The ending's tragedy is compounded by the fact that Jin saved Tsushima but doomed himself, and there's no guarantee that his sacrifice will be remembered or honoured. The shogun declared him a traitor, so official history won't celebrate the ghost, won't acknowledge that Jin's tactics saved the island when traditional methods failed. He'll be remembered as a criminal and a disgrace to the samurai class, if he's remembered at all beyond the folk legends that will eventually fade. The game is showing that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee recognition or reward, that history is often written by those in power to serve their interests, that the heroes who actually saved people are sometimes erased or vilified. Jin's reward for saving Tsushima is exile and the loss of everything he valued, and he has to find peace with that, knowing his actions mattered even if they won't be properly acknowledged. The choice between killing or sparing Shimura is brilliant because it's asking you to choose between two forms of honour. Killing Shimura is honouring his wishes and the samurai tradition, giving him the death he wants and preserving what dignity he has left. Sparing him is honouring Jin's new values, rejecting the cycle of honour-bound violence and choosing mercy even when it's harder than killing. There's no right answer because both positions are valid. Both choices reflect something true about honour and duty and love. The game trusts you to understand the weight of this decision and make it based on your own values and your interpretation of who Jin has become. Some players kill Shimura because they want to honour Jin's past and respect Shimura's wishes. Others spare him because they want Jin to fully embrace his transformation and reject the old ways completely. Both choices feel meaningful, and both leave you with complicated emotions about what just happened. The white flowers that appear on Jin's sword and armour in the final scenes are momiji, a symbol in Japanese culture of the transience of life and the beauty in impermanence. It's a perfect visual metaphor for Jin's story, This beautiful tragic moment that will fade but matters precisely because it's fleeting. The game is full of these cultural symbols and references that add layers of meaning for players who recognise them while still working on a surface level for everyone else. You don't need to know that Momiji represent impermanence to understand the emotional weight of the ending, but if you do know, it adds another dimension to what you're experiencing. This layered approach to storytelling, where the game works on multiple levels simultaneously, is part of what makes it sophisticated and rewarding to engage with deeply. The New Game Plus mode adds some nice touches for repeat playthroughs, letting you carry over your abilities and equipment while still maintaining challenge through enemy scaling. It adds new cosmetics and charms as rewards, giving you reasons to replay beyond just experiencing the story again. The game is designed to be replayed, with choices and moments that hit differently when you know where the story's going, when you understand the full weight of Jin's transformation. Playing through a second time, you notice things you missed the first time, see the foreshadowing and character development more clearly, appreciate the craft of the writing and pacing. The game rewards close attention and repeat engagement in ways that many open-world games don't, because they're too focused on content volume over content quality. The boss fights in Ghost of Tsushima are generally excellent, particularly the duels which strip away all the excess and focus on pure sword combat. The Khotan Khan fight is appropriately climactic, bringing together all your skills and techniques in a multi-phase battle that tests everything you've learned. The fight against Shimura is emotionally devastating regardless of how mechanically challenging it is, because the real difficulty is psychological, having to fight someone you love. These encounters work because they're not just mechanical challenges, they're narrative climaxes where the gameplay and story unite to create moments that are both satisfying to play and emotionally meaningful. The best boss fights in any game are the ones where the mechanics and the narrative reinforce each other, where winning feels like a story, beat as much as a gameplay achievement, and Ghost of Tsushima understands this. The way the game handles Jin's trauma and mental state is subtle, but present throughout. He's haunted by what he's seen and done, by the deaths of his friends and the people he couldn't say, by his transformation into something he was taught to despise. The Iki Island expansion makes this explicit, having Jin confront his guilt and trauma directly through the shamanic poison and the hallucinations it creates. But even in the main game, you can see the weight Jin carries in Tsuji's performance, in the way he talks about his actions, in his conversations with his allies about what they're becoming. The game doesn't make a big deal of PTSD or mental health explicitly, it's not that kind of story, but it acknowledges that violence and loss have psychological costs, that Jin is being changed by his experiences in ways that can't be fixed by victory or vindication. The seasonal changes as you move through the regions create a journey through time metaphorically, starting in late summer and moving toward winter as you push north. This isn't historically accurate. The seasons wouldn't actually change like that, but it's thematically perfect, showing Jin's journey from the relative warmth and life of summer into the cold death of winter, mirroring his transformation from honourable samurai to exiled ghost. The game uses these environmental metaphors to reinforce the emotional arc without being heavy-handed about it, trusting that players will feel the shift in atmosphere even if they don't consciously analyse what it means. The progression from golden fields to autumn forest to snowy mountains creates a natural narrative arc through the geography itself. The crafting and upgrade systems are straightforward and don't overly complicate the experience. You gather resources as you explore, use them to upgrade your weapons and armour, and the improvements are visible and meaningful. Your katana gets wrapped with different colours, your armour gets battle damage and repairs, your equipment reflects your journey through its appearance. The game doesn't bog you down with excessive inventory management or crafting complexity. It keeps it simple enough that you can engage with it without it becoming a chore. This restraint is valuable. Knowing what not to include is just as important as knowing what to add, and Ghost of Tsushima generally stays focused on what matters, rather than adding systems for the sake of having more features. The sound design deserves recognition for creating atmosphere and enhancing immersion. The clash of swords has weight and impact. Arrows whistle through the air, wind rustles through grass and trees, wildlife sounds create ambience in different regions. The game uses spatial audio effectively, letting you locate enemies by sound during stealth sections, creating tension through audio cues. The voice acting is excellent across the board, with the option to play in Japanese with subtitles for added authenticity. Most Western players probably played with English voice acting initially, but the Japanese audio track with the performances by Japanese actors is worth experiencing, adding another layer of authenticity to the experience. The fact that Sucker Punch fully recorded both English and Japanese dialogue, not just subtitled one or the other, shows their commitment to serving both audiences properly. The political and social commentary in Ghost of Tsushima is present but not heavy-handed, exploring themes about tradition versus progress, the costs of rigid social hierarchies, the gap between noble ideals and brutal realities. The samurai class is shown as both admirable and flawed, bound by honour codes that serve them but not necessarily the people they're supposed to protect. The game is critical of blind adherence to tradition without completely rejecting tradition itself, suggesting that cultures need to adapt to survive, but that adaptation requires sacrifice and loss. It's a nuanced position that avoids simplistic takes about tradition being all good or all bad, acknowledging that change is necessary but mourning what's lost in the process. These themes are relevant beyond the specific historical context, speaking to ongoing tensions between preservation and progress in every culture. The romance elements, or rather the lack thereof, are notable, because Jin never gets a romantic subplot despite opportunities for one with Yuna or other characters. The game keeps Jin focused on his mission and his internal conflict, not distracted by romantic feelings that would complicate the themes about duty and sacrifice. Jin's relationships are about friendship and loyalty and family, not romance, and that's refreshing in a medium that often feels obligated to include romantic subplots regardless of whether they serve the story. Jin's most important relationship is with Shimura, a father-son bond that's complicated and painful and ultimately tragic. That relationship carries the emotional weight of the story, and adding romance would have diluted that focus. The pop culture impact of Ghost of Tsushima extended beyond gaming into broader consciousness, with the game being referenced in other media, inspiring fan art and cosplay and creative works. The distinctive visual style and aesthetic became instantly recognizable. The silhouette of Jin in his ghost outfit with his katana is an iconic image now. The game contributed to a broader Western interest in Japanese culture and history, joining anime and manga in making Japanese media more mainstream and acceptable in Western pop culture. It's part of a larger cultural moment where Western audiences are engaging with non-Western cultures more seriously and respectfully, moving beyond exoticism and stereotypes toward genuine appreciation and understanding. Ghost of Tsushima isn't solely responsible for this shift, obviously, but it's a significant part of it, showing that Western creators can engage with other cultures thoughtfully and create something that's both commercially successful and culturally respectful. The legacy of Ghost of Tsushima in gaming is still being written, but it's already clear that the game influenced how developers think about open-world design, particularly in terms of UI minimalism and natural navigation. Other games have started experimenting with reducing UI clutter and using diegetic navigation methods, following the wind or environmental cues rather than GPS markers. The game proved that you could make a massive Festest-A open-world game that respects artistic vision and cultural authenticity while still being commercially successful, that you don't have to dumb things down or fill your game with monetization to reach a wide audience. It showed that there's still room for games with clear creative direction and focused narratives in an industry obsessed with games as service and endless content. The announcement of Ghost of Yotei, the sequel set in 1603 Hokkaido with a new protagonist, suggests that Sucker Punch understands they created something special and wants to continue exploring this world and these themes. Moving to a different time period and location with a new protagonist is smart, avoiding the trap of just retreading the same ground or forcing Jin's story to continue past its natural conclusion. Jin's arc is complete, his story was told, and trying to extend it would diminish the tragedy and meaning of his sacrifice. A new protagonist in a new era allows them to explore different aspects of Japanese history and culture, to tell new stories within the same thematic framework. It's the right creative decision even if some fans would prefer to continue playing as Jin. What makes Ghost of Tsushima a masterpiece is how all these elements come together into a cohesive whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. The gameplay reinforces the themes, the visual design serves the narrative, the world building creates immersion, the character development drives emotional investment, and the story has something meaningful to say about honour, duty, sacrifice, and the costs of change. It's a game that respects its source material and its audience, that trusts players to engage with complex themes and uncomfortable truths, that commits to its artistic vision even when that means making choices that might not please everyone. The game has flaws, the open world content can be repetitive, the villains are underdeveloped, the social commentary could go deeper. But these weaknesses don't significantly detract from the overall achievement, they're minor blemishes on something that's fundamentally excellent. The game succeeds because it knows exactly what it wants to be, and executes that vision with remarkable consistency and craft. Every decision serves the larger goals of creating an experience that feels like a playable Kurosawa film, that honours samurai cinema while still being distinctively a video game, that explores meaningful themes about tradition and change through both narrative and mechanics. The attention to detail in every aspect, from the way grass moves in the wind to the cultural accuracy of the architecture, to the sound design to the character animations, creates a level of polish and coherence that's rare in games this ambitious. Ghost of Tsushima is a masterpiece because it aimed high and actually achieved what it was reaching for, creating an experience that's beautiful, emotionally resonant, thematically rich, and deeply respectful of the culture it's drawing from. Years after release, the game holds up remarkably well, still stunning visually, still emotionally powerful, still mechanically satisfying. The story of Jin Sakai and his transformation from samurai to ghost still hits hard, still makes you think about the costs of pragmatism and the weight of tradition, still leaves you with complicated feelings about honour and duty and sacrifice. The game proved that Western developers can engage with non-Western cultures thoughtfully and create something meaningful rather than just appropriating aesthetics. It proved that single-player narrative games still have a place in the industry. It proved that you can make something artistically ambitious while still being accessible and commercially successful. And most importantly, it created an experience that matters to people, that they remember and return to, that influenced how they think about games and culture and storytelling. That's what masterpieces do. They create experiences that stay with you and change how you see things. And Ghost of Tsushima absolutely achieved that. It's a landmark game that will be remembered as one of the best of its generation. A perfect example of what game development can accomplish when vision, craft, and respect for source material all align.